The valley looked frozen in time. Under a pale moon and a sky full of sharp stars, millions of dollars worth of modern harvest equipment sat silent across the fields of Cedar Hollow. Screens glowed, warning lights flashed, but not a single machine was moving. Then, through the white haze of creeping frost, one old red Farmall tractor appeared. Its engine rattled like a relic from another century as 72-year-old Walt Harlan guided it across the wheat fields. The wind cut through his coat, ice formed along the fence posts, and behind him, desperate farmers began following his tracks through the darkness. Just hours earlier, many of those same people had laughed when he warned them. Now, nobody was laughing, because the harvest that fed an entire county depended on whether an old farmer had been right all along. If you're listening from a small farming town, a quiet country road, or anywhere that still believes old lessons are worth remembering, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges speak to you, consider subscribing before we return to the day this story truly began. 3 weeks before that frozen night, life in Cedar Hollow moved at the steady pace it always had. The town sat in the rolling wheat country of Mason County, Kansas, where grain elevators stood taller than church steeples and people measured seasons by planting dates rather than calendar pages. Most families had known each other for generations. News traveled faster than the wind, and memories lasted even longer. At the northern edge of town stood Harlan Ridge Farm. The farm covered just over 400 acres, spread across gentle hills and shallow valleys that Walter Harlan knew better than anyone alive. At 72 years old, Walt still walked the fields every morning before sunrise. Long before the coffee finished brewing, he would already be checking the soil, studying the sky, and listening to sounds most people ignored. He wasn't looking for anything special. He was simply paying attention. Ever since his wife Ruth passed away 4 years earlier, those quiet walks had become part of his routine. The farm felt different without her. Larger somehow. Emptier. Their small white farmhouse sat beneath 2 old cottonwood trees. The porch swing still creaked in the evening breeze. Ruth's gardening gloves still hung inside the mudroom. And in the corner of the kitchen rested a weathered leather notebook filled with decades of handwritten observations. Ruth had recorded everything: wind directions, rainfall totals, late frosts, bird migrations, even unusual cloud formations. 41 years of notes filled its pages. Most people would have called it an old journal. To Walt, it was something closer to a family history. His granddaughter Ellie understood that better than anyone. At 13 years old, she spent nearly every weekend at Harlan Ridge. While her friends stared at phone screens, Ellie followed her grandfather through fields and fence lines, asking questions about crops, weather, and stories from years long before she was born. One afternoon, as they repaired a section of fence near the western pasture, Ellie noticed a flock of swallows flying unusually low over the grass. "Grandpa," she asked, pointing toward the birds, "why are they flying so close to the ground?" Walt paused. For several seconds he watched them circle above the pasture. Then he looked toward the distant horizon. The answer didn't come right away. Something about the sky had suddenly caught his attention. And for the first time that season, a feeling he couldn't quite explain settled heavily in his chest. The feeling stayed with Walt all the way home. That evening, after Ellie left with her mother, he sat alone at the kitchen table and opened Ruth's weather journal. The leather cover was worn smooth from decades of use. Some pages carried faint smudges from dirt-stained fingers. Others held tiny notes squeezed into the margins whenever Ruth had noticed something unusual. Walt slowly turned page after page. Most years followed familiar patterns: rain, heat, harvest, winter. Then he stopped. A date from September of 1983 stared back at him. Ruth had underlined 3 observations: swallows flying low, anthills built unusually high, a strange damp scent riding the evening wind. Walt quietly read the entry twice. Outside, the cottonwood leaves rustled against the darkness. Inside, the kitchen suddenly felt much colder. The next morning, Cedar Hollow gathered at the county fairgrounds for the annual harvest planning meeting. Nearly every major farmer in Mason County attended. So did Blake Renshaw. At 38 years old, Blake represented everything modern agriculture promised. He had earned a degree in agricultural systems management and spent years building Cedar Hollow growers into one of the most successful cooperatives in the region. Farmers respected him because he produced results. Large digital displays filled the meeting hall. Weather projections, satellite imagery, soil moisture reports, yield forecasts. Everything pointed toward an excellent harvest season. Blake stood confidently at the front of the room. "Our systems are showing stable conditions for at least another 10 days, he explained. "No frost risk, no severe weather events. This gives everyone enough time to maximize grain maturity before harvest begins." Several farmers nodded. The numbers looked convincing. Walt remained silent near the back wall. He listened carefully. He studied every chart. But something bothered him. When the presentation ended, he slowly raised his hand. The room became quiet. "What about the valley fields?" Walt asked. Blake smiled politely. "What about them?" "The low ground around Cedar Creek." Walt replied. "Your sensors aren't covering most of that area." A few people exchanged glances. Blake clicked to another slide. "The data has been calibrated across the entire district." "Not the same thing," Walt answered. Blake's smile tightened. "With respect, Walt, we're using hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment and weather modeling. And with respect," Walt said calmly, "I've been watching those fields for 50 years. The silence lasted only a moment. Then Earl Dobbs chuckled from the third row. "Here we go again." Several others laughed softly, not cruelly, just enough. Enough for Walt to feel it. Blake wasn't trying to embarrass him. In fact, Blake genuinely believed he was helping the community move forward. "We appreciate experience," Blake said. "But modern forecasting is far more accurate than weather signs." Most people agreed. The meeting moved on. Yet as farmers filed out of the building, Walt noticed something strange near the edge of the parking lot. A line of ants was carrying dirt toward the top of an unusually tall mound. He stared at it for several seconds. Then he looked toward the western sky. Dark clouds rested far beyond the horizon, and for the second time in 2 days, the uneasy feeling returned. That evening, Walt drove out to the northern boundary of Harlan Ridge Farm. The wheat stretched across the hills in waves of gold, nearly ready for harvest. In another year, the sight might have filled him with pride. Instead, it filled him with worry. He parked beside an old fence line and stepped out into the fading light. The wind was shifting. Not strongly. Not enough for most people to notice. But Walt noticed. For decades, he and Ruth had paid attention to details that never appeared on weather reports. They had learned that the land often spoke quietly before it shouted. A cool breeze carried the faint scent of damp leaves. Walt closed his eyes. The smell instantly pulled him backward through time. September, 1983. A year when frost arrived nearly a week earlier than expected. A year when many farmers lost a significant portion of their crops. A year Ruth never forgot. Back then, the two of them had spent an entire night fighting to save what they could. The memory lingered as he returned home. Waiting on the porch was a pickup truck he recognized immediately. His son Daniel had come to visit. Daniel Harlan was 43 years old and practical by nature. Unlike his father, he trusted numbers more than instincts. Years of working in agricultural logistics had taught him to rely on planning, contracts, and forecasts. The relationship between father and son remained strong, but it wasn't always easy. Inside the kitchen, Daniel poured coffee while Walt opened the refrigerator. "You went to the cooperative meeting?" Daniel asked. Walt nodded. "And let me guess, you argued with Blake?" I asked a question. Daniel smiled, which usually means you argued. For a moment, both men laughed. Then the mood shifted. Daniel set his cup down. "Dad, I've looked at the forecasts." "So have I. The models show stable temperatures." "The models don't live here." Daniel sighed. This was familiar territory. Neither man enjoyed these conversations. "Maybe things are different now," Daniel said carefully. Walt looked toward the window. Beyond the glass, evening shadows stretched across the yard. "Maybe," but his voice carried little conviction. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. "If the harvest goes badly this year, we're going to have some hard decisions to make." Walt already knew what those words meant. Debt, equipment costs, property taxes, the possibility of selling a section of land. Nothing terrified him more. Not because of money, because of what the farm represented. 5 generations of Harlans had worked this ground. Every fence line held a memory. Every field carried a story. The thought of losing even part of it felt unbearable. After Daniel left, Ellie arrived unexpectedly on her bicycle. She carried Ruth's weather journal under one arm. "I found something," she said. Together they sat at the kitchen table. Ellie carefully opened the notebook to a page marked with a faded ribbon. Ruth's handwriting filled the paper. At the top of the page stood a date, September 1983. Beneath it were the exact same signs Walt had noticed during the past week. Low swallows, tall ant mounds, a damp smell in the evening wind, and one final note. When frost comes early, the valley always knows first. Walt stared at the words. His heart began beating faster, because outside the kitchen window, hanging beside the porch door, the old brass barometer had suddenly dropped lower than it had all season, and according to every forecast in Mason County, that shouldn't have been possible. The next morning, Walt carried Ruth's weather journal into town. He rarely brought the notebook anywhere. Some things felt too personal to leave the farm. But as he drove toward Calhoun Feed and Grain, he could not shake the feeling that time was running short. The feed store sat at the center of Cedar Hollow's daily life. Farmers gathered there before sunrise, exchanging weather predictions, equipment complaints, and local rumors over paper cups of coffee. When Walt walked inside, conversation slowed, not because people disliked him. Most respected him. But everyone knew about the disagreement at the cooperative meeting, and everyone knew Walt still believed something was coming. Near the back of the store stood Blake Renshaw. He was reviewing harvest schedules with several growers using a tablet loaded with maps and weather projections. Blake noticed Walt immediately. "Morning?" "Walt." "Morning," The other farmers quietly stepped aside. Nobody wanted another argument. Unfortunately, that wasn't entirely possible. Walt placed Ruth's journal on the counter. "Take a look." Blake glanced down. "What's this? 41 years of weather records." A few nearby farmers leaned closer. Blake opened the notebook politely. He flipped through several pages. Rainfall, temperatures, crop notes, handwritten observations. "What am I looking for?" Blake asked. Walt pointed to a page from 1983. The same signs we're seeing right now. Blake studied the entry. For a brief moment, uncertainty crossed his face. Then he shook his head. "I appreciate this. I really do. But records from 40 years ago don't outweigh current forecasting systems." Several farmers nodded. The logic sounded reasonable. Walt knew it did. That was the problem. The modern forecasts weren't foolish. They were simply missing something. "The valley fields are different," Walt insisted. "They always have been." Blake remained calm. "Our network covers the county, not the low ground. The models compensate for that." Walt folded his arms. The models weren't here in 1983. A few chuckles echoed through the store. Then Earl Dobbs laughed louder than anyone. "Next thing you know, we'll be predicting weather with squirrels and crickets." The room erupted with nervous laughter. Even people who respected Walt couldn't help smiling. Walt forced himself not to react. Humiliation was easier to endure than watching people ignore a warning. Across the room, Nora Pike quietly observed the exchange. As assistant manager at Prairie Trust Bank, she spent most of her time reviewing farm loans and crop reports. Unlike many others, she noticed something in Walt's expression. He wasn't trying to win an argument. He was genuinely afraid. That bothered her. After the discussion ended, farmers returned to their conversations. Blake shook Walt's hand before leaving. There was no anger between them, only disagreement. Outside, the afternoon sun remained warm. The forecast still looked favorable. Everything suggested Blake was correct. Yet as Walt drove home, he noticed something else. Thin white frost lingered beneath a shaded fence line near Cedar Creek. It should have melted hours earlier. Instead, it remained hidden beneath the grass. A small detail, easy to overlook, but not for Walt. Because 40 years earlier, Ruth had circled the exact same warning sign in her journal, and 3 days later, an early frost had devastated half the valley. This time, however, nobody seemed willing to listen. That night, sleep refused to come. Walt lay awake listening to the wind brush against the cottonwood trees outside his bedroom window. Every few hours he got up and checked the old brass barometer hanging beside the back door. Each time, the needle sat a little lower. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough to make him uneasy. Before sunrise, he made a decision. If nobody else was going to prepare, he would. The old Farmall tractor sat inside the machine shed beneath a layer of dust collected over years of limited use. Its faded red paint carried scars from decades of work. Most farmers in Mason County considered it a relic. To Walt, it was a trusted partner. He pulled the cover away and ran his hand across the hood. Near the front panel, a small carving remained visible beneath the paint. R+W. Frost 83. He smiled sadly. The carving had been Ruth's idea after the difficult harvest they survived together more than 40 years earlier. Back then they had believed the tractor had saved the farm. Now he wondered if it might have one final job left to do. The engine groaned when he tried to start it. Once, twice, 3 times. Finally it came alive with a rough metallic growl. For a moment, Walt felt hope. Then a sharp snap echoed beneath the hood. The engine immediately died. Walt climbed down and inspected the damage. A cracked drive belt hung loose inside the engine compartment. He closed his eyes. Of course. Nothing was easy anymore. By mid-morning, he was lying beneath the tractor trying to repair it when Daniel's pickup rolled into the yard. His son stepped out and immediately understood what was happening. "Dad." Walt continued working. "Dad." Still no response. Daniel sighed. "You're really doing this." "I'm preparing for something that isn't coming." That stung more than Walt expected. Not because Daniel intended to be cruel, because part of him feared his son might be right. The argument lasted nearly an hour. Neither man raised his voice. That somehow made it worse. Daniel wasn't dismissing his father. He genuinely believed the forecasts. The evidence seemed to support them. Eventually, Daniel pointed toward the wheat fields. "If you're wrong, you'll cost yourself money we don't have." Walt stared across the farm. The numbers weighed heavily on him. Fuel wasn't cheap. Repairs weren't cheap. Nothing was cheap anymore. After Daniel left, another visitor arrived. Nora Pike. She parked near the barn and approached carefully. "I probably shouldn't be here," she admitted. "What brings you out?" She hesitated. "The bank received updated harvest projections this morning. And if anyone harvests ahead of the cooperative schedule, it could affect certain insurance protections." Walt understood immediately. Another warning. Another reason not to act. Another reason to trust the system. By sunset, he sat alone inside the barn, staring at the Farmall. The repair bill would take nearly all the cash he had left. For the first time, doubt hit him hard. Maybe he was chasing ghosts. Maybe grief had convinced him to see patterns that no longer mattered. Maybe everyone else was right. Then Ellie appeared carrying a folded page she had found tucked deep inside Ruth's weather journal. A page Walt had never seen before. And what was written there made his hands tremble. Ellie unfolded the page with both hands, careful not to tear the brittle paper. It was written in Ruth's handwriting, but not like the other journal entries. The usual notes were neat, measured, almost scientific. This page felt different, more urgent. Walt adjusted his glasses and read slowly. "If the swallows stay low after sunset and the ants seal high before dark, do not wait for the radio. The cold will settle in the valley first. Cut the low strips. Pull canvas over the creek side. Open the north ditch before midnight. Smoke the hollow if the wind dies." For a long while, Walt said nothing. The barn seemed to grow quiet around him. Ellie watched his face. "Grandpa," he swallowed hard. "Your grandmother wrote this after '83. "Why didn't you know?" Walt stared at the page. Because after Ruth died, he had only read the parts of the journal that didn't hurt too much. Rain totals, planting notes, harvest numbers. He had skipped the pages where her voice felt too alive. He folded the paper carefully and placed it on the workbench. Then he walked to the back of the barn, where old canvas tarps hung from wooden pegs. They were dusty, stiff, and stained from years of use, but still mostly whole. Beside them sat a rusted drag bar, several chains, and a small sickle mower attachment. tools from another time, tools most people had forgotten. Walt looked at them as if seeing old friends return from war. By morning, he drove to Amos Reed's place. Amos was 86, thin as a fence rail, and one of the few men in Mason County who remembered the 1983 frost as clearly as Walt did. He sat on his porch with a blanket over his knees and listened while Walt described the signs. When Walt finished, Amos looked toward the fields. "Ruth saw it before any of us back then," he said. "You remember?" "I remember everybody calling her nervous. Then I remember half the county wishing they'd listened." Walt nodded slowly. Amos pointed with one shaky hand toward the north end of the valley. "That old drainage ditch still there?" "Barely." "Open it." Walt frowned. "For water?" "For cold air," Amos said. "That hollow traps it like a bowl. Your daddy knew that. Mine did too." The words settled deep inside Walt. The solution wasn't one thing. It was several small things remembered at once. The journal, the canvas, the ditch, the Farmall, the old way of reading land as if it were alive. Back at Harlan Ridge, Walt made his final decision. He sold the last 6 head of cattle he owned to pay for fuel, a drive belt, and parts for the tractor. Watching the cattle trailer leave the yard hurt more than he expected. Those animals were not just money. They were part of the farm's rhythm, part of what was left of Ruth's daily chores. But there was no other choice. By late afternoon, he had the Farmall running again. Its engine coughed, rattled, then steadied. Ellie smiled for the first time in days. Then Walt's phone buzzed. A message from Cedar Hollow growers appeared on the screen. All cooperative members are advised to follow the official harvest schedule. Unauthorized early harvest activity may affect contract standing. Walt read it twice. The sun was already dropping behind the wheat, and now, to save the field, he might have to stand against the whole town. The next day felt wrong from the moment the sun rose, not because of anything dramatic, because of what wasn't there. The usual morning breeze never arrived. The air sat heavy over Mason County, still and strangely quiet. Walt noticed it immediately. By noon, he was walking the western edge of Harlan Ridge Farm with Ellie beside him. The wheat had swayed only slightly despite the open fields. Even the birds seemed restless. Then they saw them. Hundreds of swallows, flying low, very low. They skimmed the tops of the wheat as if something invisible were pressing them downward. Ellie looked up. "Is that bad?" Walt didn't answer right away. His eyes followed the birds. Every instinct he possessed screamed the same warning. The cold was coming. And it was coming faster than expected. Later that afternoon, he drove into town one final time. He found Blake Renshaw at the Cedar Hollow grower's office reviewing harvest maps. Blake looked exhausted. The upcoming harvest represented months of planning and millions of dollars in contracts. He wasn't a villain. He was carrying enormous responsibility, which made what happened next even harder. "You still think frost is coming?" Blake asked. "I know it is." Blake rubbed his forehead. "Walt, every forecast update says otherwise. Forecasts don't smell the wind." Blake almost smiled. "That's not exactly scientific." "No," Walt admitted, "but neither is ignoring 50 years of watching the same valley." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Walt pointed toward the map hanging on the wall. "Your sensors are all on high ground." Blake followed his finger. The realization seemed to flicker across his face. Only briefly. Then responsibility won over doubt. We can't change the harvest schedule based on feelings. They're not feelings. They're observations. Old observations. Still observations. The conversation ended exactly where every previous one had ended. Neither man convinced the other. Outside the office, Walt stopped near the parking lot. Nora Pike was standing beside her truck. She had overheard enough to understand what was happening. "You really believe we're in trouble?" she asked quietly. Walt looked toward the horizon. Dark gray clouds sat far beyond the western plains. Not storm clouds. Something colder. Something stranger. "Let me ask you something," he said. "When was the last time the bank checked conditions in the valley fields instead of the hilltops?" Nora frowned. She didn't have an answer. That evening, temperatures began falling faster than forecast models predicted. Only slightly at first. 1 degree, then another. Most people never noticed, but Nora did. She stayed late at the bank reviewing weather updates and sensor reports. Around 8 o'clock, she discovered something troubling. The primary monitoring station sat almost 70 feet higher than the lowest fields near Cedar Creek. The difference seemed small, until cold air started settling. Meanwhile, back at Harlan Ridge, Walt climbed onto the repaired Farmall. The old engine roared to life beneath the darkening sky. Ellie stood beside the barn. "Grandpa." "Yeah. What if you're wrong?" Walt stared across the wheat fields glowing beneath the sunset. Then he answered honestly, "What scares me is that I might be right." Far above them, the swallows disappeared into the gathering dusk, and for the first time all season, the temperature dropped sharply before the sun was completely gone. By 10 o'clock that night, Cedar Hollow was wrapped in an uneasy silence. The sky was perfectly clear. No storm clouds, no rain, nothing that looked dangerous. That was what made it so deceptive. Most people associated disaster with something they could see coming. This danger arrived quietly. Temperature readings across the county still appeared acceptable on the cooperative's monitoring system. But down in the valley near Cedar Creek, reality was beginning to tell a different story. A thin layer of cold air settled over the low ground like invisible water filling a bowl. Walt saw it immediately. He drove the Farmall toward the northern fields while Ellie followed in the pickup carrying canvas tarps, chains, and old tools from the barn. The tractor's headlights cut through the darkness. The engine rattled steadily beneath him. Old, slow, reliable. Exactly what he needed. At the same time, Nora Pike sat in the cooperative office staring at fresh sensor reports. The numbers no longer made sense. Several readings from lower elevations were dropping much faster than forecast models predicted. She picked up the phone. Moments later, Blake answered. "You need to see this," Nora said. 20 minutes later, Blake was standing beside her desk reviewing the data. The color drained from his face. "That's impossible." Nora pointed toward the elevation charts. "No." Blake remained silent. For the first time, doubt broke through his confidence. Meanwhile, Walt had already begun. Following Ruth's notes, he opened sections of the old north drainage ditch. The work was exhausting. Cold air naturally flowed downhill. The ditch helped guide part of that air away from the most vulnerable wheat. Next came the canvas. Using chains attached to the Farmall, he dragged large tarps into position along the creekside fields. The process was painfully slow, but every minute mattered. Near midnight, another vehicle appeared across the field. Blake's truck. He stepped out and walked toward the tractor. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The temperature continued falling. Finally, Blake broke the silence. "You were right about the valley." Walt shut off the tractor and climbed down. The admission clearly cost Blake something: responsibility, pride, maybe both. "Doesn't matter who's right," Walt replied. "We need to move." At that moment, a warning alarm sounded from one of the cooperative's newer harvesting machines parked nearby. The cold had triggered a sensor lockout. Another machine failed moments later, then another. Modern systems designed for efficiency were suddenly refusing to operate. Not because they were bad machines, because they had never been built for this exact situation. The irony was impossible to ignore. Within an hour, farmers began arriving from across Cedar Hollow. Earl Dobbs came first, then several others. No one laughed anymore. Everyone worked. They pulled tarps, opened ditches, moved equipment, followed Walt's instructions. By 3 in the morning, the entire valley shimmered beneath a layer of white frost. Fence posts glittered. Windshields froze. Wheat fields sparkled beneath moonlight like fields of glass. And as the first hint of dawn appeared in the east, nobody knew whether their desperate efforts had been enough. Because beneath that beautiful layer of frost, the future of an entire harvest waited for the morning sun. Morning came slowly over Cedar Hollow. The first light did not warm the valley. It only revealed what the night had done. Farmers stood along the edges of their fields in heavy coats, staring across acres of wheat glazed with frost. No one spoke much. The usual jokes were gone. Even Earl Dobbs kept his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the ground. Walt walked the creekside field with Ellie beside him. Every few yards, he bent down and touched the wheat heads gently between his fingers. Some were damaged. There was no denying that. The frost had bitten hard in places the tarps had not reached. But along the strips where the canvas had held, and where the old ditch had drawn cold air away from the hollow, the wheat still carried life. The color was pale, but not dead. Ellie looked at him with wide eyes. "Did it work?" Walt exhaled slowly. "Some of it." Across the valley, the difference became impossible to ignore. Fields that had followed the cooperative schedule without protection showed silver-burned heads and darkened stems in the lowest places. Not all were ruined, but enough had suffered to make every farmer feel sick. Then there were Walt's fields, and the few nearby sections where people had finally followed his instructions in the night. Those fields were hurt, but standing. Blake arrived near sunrise, his boots crunching through the frosted grass. He carried no tablet this time. Only a small notebook and a face lined with exhaustion. For a long moment he stood beside Walt and looked over the valley. "I'm sorry," Blake said quietly. Walt didn't answer right away. He watched the sunlight touch the wheat. Being sorry won't bring back what froze. "No," Blake said, "it won't." There was no triumph in Walt's expression. He had not wanted to be right. That was what some people finally understood. Near the road, Nora Pike spoke with 2 farmers and a representative from the mill. The mill still needed grain, but only if enough usable wheat could be harvested quickly. The warning came within the hour. If Cedar Hollow could gather and deliver the surviving crop before the damaged heads worsened, the county might still keep part of its contract, but they would have to move immediately. Every available machine, every available hand. Blake looked toward the line of modern harvesters parked near the cooperative sheds. Some were running again. Others still needed technicians after the cold triggered faults overnight. Then he looked at Walt's old Farmall. The tractor sat beneath a coat of frost, engine ticking softly from hours of hard work. It looked tired, almost human. Earl Dobbs approached with his hat in his hands. For once, his voice carried no humor. "Walt," he said, "if we follow that ditch line and use your tarps on the lower farms, could we save more before noon?" Walt looked at him, then at Blake, then at the damaged valley. The answer would cost him. The Farmall had barely survived the night. The clutch was slipping. The engine was overheating. If he pushed it again, it might not come back to the shed. But beyond the road stood neighbors who had laughed at him, and families who still needed a harvest. Walt wiped frost from the tractor seat. "Get the chains," he said. Blake lowered his eyes, and one by one, the men who had trusted machines over memory began following the old farmer back into the field. For the next 2 days, Cedar Hollow worked harder than it had in years. The harvest became a race against time. Combines rolled from field to field. Grain trucks lined dusty roads before sunrise. Farmers who had barely spoken to one another all season suddenly shared equipment, labor, and fuel. At the center of it all was Walt's old Farmall. The tractor pulled canvas, dragged equipment, helped clear drainage paths, and hauled supplies wherever they were needed. It never moved quickly. But it never stopped, not until the afternoon of the second day. Walt was crossing a rough section of ground near Cedar Creek when the engine gave a deep metallic knock. He knew immediately, the sound every farmer fears. The Farmall shuddered, coughed, then rolled silently to a stop. For several moments, nobody moved. Walt climbed down slowly and rested one hand on the hood. The metal was still warm. This machine had carried his family through droughts, floods, storms, and decades of harvests. Now its work was finally done. Ellie stood beside him. "You can fix it, right?" Walt smiled gently. Maybe, but both of them knew the truth. Some things earned the right to rest. By the end of the week, the numbers became clear. The county had lost part of its crop. There was no miracle, no perfect ending. Some farmers suffered real damage. Some fields never recovered. Yet enough grain survived to keep the mill contract alive. Enough survived to protect families from financial disaster. Enough survived to give Cedar Hollow another season. A week later, the cooperative held a public meeting. The room was packed. Farmers filled every chair. Blake Renshaw stood at the front. For a long moment, he simply looked at the crowd. Then he cleared his throat. "The weather models were not wrong," he began. "They were incomplete." The room remained silent. "We trusted data. We should have. But we ignored local knowledge that had been earned over generations." Then he turned toward Walt. "I did." The admission carried weight. Not because it was dramatic, because it was honest. Blake announced that beginning next season, Cedar Hollow growers would create a local observation program alongside its forecasting systems. Weather journals, field reports, historical records. Everything would be considered, technology and experience together, not one replacing the other. Later that evening, Daniel walked beside his father through the wheat stubble. The harvest was over. The fields felt strangely empty. "I talked to the accountant," Daniel said. Walt waited. "We don't have to sell any land." The words hung in the cool evening air. For the first time in months, Walt felt a burden lift from his shoulders. Not all of it. Just enough. Near the farmhouse. Ellie sat on the porch with Ruth's weather journal open in her lap. A brand new notebook rested beside it. As a flock of swallows skimmed low across the fading sky, she carefully wrote the first entry. A new generation, a new season, and another page waiting to be filled. Some stories stay with us because they remind us that wisdom does not always arrive wearing a suit, carrying a degree, or speaking through a computer screen. Sometimes it arrives in muddy boots. Sometimes it lives in an old notebook. Sometimes it survives in the quiet observations of people who spent a lifetime paying attention. Walt Harlan never wanted to prove anyone wrong. He never wanted to win an argument. In truth, he would have been happier if the frost had never come at all. What mattered was not being right. What mattered was protecting something he loved. His family, his neighbors, his farm. And perhaps that is why people finally listened. Not because he spoke louder, but because he cared deeply enough to keep speaking when nobody wanted to hear it. Many of us have known someone like that. A grandparent, a neighbor, a farmer, a mechanic, someone whose knowledge came from years of experience rather than headlines or technology. Someone people underestimated until the day they were needed. Most. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, we'd love to hear about them. Leave a comment and share their story. And if you haven't already, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel, and how many people still appreciate the values that built small communities across America. If you enjoyed spending time in Cedar Hollow, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and joining us for another story soon. Until next time, take care of the people around you, pay attention to the small things, and never underestimate the value of lessons that have stood the test of time.